One major thing that I've learned recently around AI tools is we use MCPs for situations where we want to connect Claude to an external tool. For example, I connect it to my task list, which uses an app called Todoist. Okay, so I go in there and I can say to Claude, what's on my task list? Or I can voice dump, brain dump a load of stuff on a voice note and say, I need to do this, I need to do that, I'm not sure about doing this thing. And it can take all of those actions for me. So it can actually just do all of those tasks. And this is where that's useful. But then I also use that app, I have that app here on my phone. So I can interact with the app either in the interface or through Claude. So for example, if I wanted to have a project which had other team members, then using something like Todoist, rather than a list, on a local file on my computer or something which only Claude knows from its memory of me, it's interacting with a tool which natively has that functionality. So for example, I'm working with this guy next to me on a project. I want to tell Claude what all of his skills are versus what all of my skills are. We're going to work out the plan. And then I want it to allocate the tasks to each person based on what we're good at. I want to add due dates so that it's done in milestones. That's not something which I would even consider doing manually, but I would know what good looks like, right? I would look at it and say, yeah, that sounds right. If it started assigning tasks in a totally random fashion, the point is that working with tools which natively do what you would want them to do and integrating AI completely levels up the system. The most simple version of this is Claude Code and Obsidian for writing a journal. I can just brain dump to Claude and say, add all this to my journal and then analyze it. And then reference any old posts and tell me any patterns here that I'm not seeing. And it just does that. It just does that for fun, And sometimes it will just make things up. And I have to say, really often, what are you talking about? Why are you suggesting this? So, for example, one of the ways that I've had to improve the way it does journal analysis, I had to get it to separate its analysis from a summary of what it could observe. I wanted a clear distinction between these are the observations summarized, and this is the analysis about those observations and what it's based on, with references to other specific files, whether that's a people file where it describes my relationship to that person and notes about them, and also whether that's something in my CRM or a task. I want reference. I don't want it to do analysis unless it's based on something, because it would just make things up and say them really confidently, but they're completely false. If you're prepared to wade through that to get to good value and useful information, then you can do it. The way I think of this shared access is the tools which share human interaction and AI interaction. So I was trying to design a solution for a company who has a distributed team to be able to use a knowledge base that could be used across multiple users in Claude, with their own accounts and potentially different access levels. For example, one does customer support, one does marketing, and having access to the different relevant context. And I'm used to working with Obsidian. And I actually switched to Obsidian from Notion just purely because at the time, Obsidian was what people were using to work with Claude Code. But actually, Notion works pretty well with Claude Code. And the problem I've got with Obsidian is that I have to use something called Sync Thing to synchronize it between my devices. So I've got it on a VPS, my MacBook, and my phone. It's a local file that actually lives on the VPS. The source is on the VPS. And then that's synchronized to the phone and laptop. But with Notion, you don't have to do that. It has a good interface with Notion. It can do everything. Read, write databases, make pages, make child pages, add different properties to databases. I think at the moment it can't delete pages. Possibly the API doesn't let you delete pages. I'm not 100% sure, but it can do basically everything you would need it to do. And the benefit as well is that you don't have to manage that. right? It just synchronizes everywhere. If you have people connected to certain pages as a team, they have access to that through their own Notion account. That's great. If you were going to try and do that with Obsidian and have local files and everything like that, then that's a completely different story. It's not something that I would expect people to want to maintain. That's just overhead. So having a system where humans can use Notion and write to Notion and find things easily in Notion, and it looks nicer than Markdown. So there's less, Markdown is for developers. Let's face it. Like, people who aren't developers don't really use, like, when do you interact with Markdown? Unless you're working on software. You just probably don't. At least not in the traditional way of like having an IDE open, like VS Code, and then like actually making .md files. Whereas Notion is just a much more familiar interface, and it's going to be a tool that people would actually use. The problem with something that relied on a lot of Markdown files or needed a lot of maintenance, people might stop using that after a couple of weeks. And the other thing I liked about Notion is that you can structure the information in a way that makes it more queryable for Claude. So, for example, the case that this was for, their team was using Google Drive, but all of the data was super unstructured. Converting some of the high signal information, for example, the SOPs, the supplier list, the team information, what each person works on, converting all of that into simple Notion databases, it opens up a lot of capabilities, because now Claude can reference that information, it can search that information. I'm dealing with this case, what should I do? Okay, this is what it says in the SOPs. Alright, when was the SOPs last updated? And then having a date property in the database. Oh, this hasn't been updated for 3 years. Okay, can we have a look at all of the SOPs that haven't been updated in the last 2 years and just make sure that they're still relevant? Is there any stale information? Is there anything conflicting? That's something you would have to look at manually. Like, I started watching a series last night. I think it's called Criminal something on Apple TV. The premise was that they'd had a phone call from someone who said that her boyfriend murdered his ex-girlfriend and someone else was doing the time for it in jail. And the detective's method of looking that up was to print out a list of everyone who was in a certain prison, and then was circling all of the ones which it said were done for murder. Then she had to manually check those names and see how long the sentence was, because they knew it was 24 years. And I was just like, I'm not even fucking watching this. There's no way that that's what the system looks like. And so we now basically have semantic search of our own custom knowledge bases. The same way which you had this like Google brain effect, where people forgot information but they remembered how to find it. Like in my video I was editing earlier, I was talking about these trees in Southampton, and they're like 70 years old, and I 170 years old, and I didn't know the exact number, but I remembered how I found it before. We still have this, and like there's a lot of information. I don't know some of the file structure in my Obsidian, for example the CRM. I've never had to open a file manually. Claude knows how to open the files manually. You can basically create that for yourself. What I suggest is taking the highest signal information, the stuff which is actually going to be useful, because there's no point in copying someone else's system. You have to find information which is useful to you, structure it in a way that Claude can use it, structure it in a tool which your team can access it, that they're actually going to use. And then when you combine those things, if your team is using it, they're updating tasks, or they're in Asana, they're updating, then Claude is getting new context as well. So the team's work lives in the app, like Notion or Todoist or Asana, but now your Claude can still query and get the most up-to-date information. So when you say, hey, what tasks are left to do on this product launch, it can find that out. Whereas if you ask your team to start using pieces of software they've never used before, or interacting with types of files that they don't even have a program on their computer to open or edit, then they're not going to use it. And you're going to set something up that's going to just be a waste of time. And this has really changed the way that I look at MCP. MCP, for it to be useful to Claude, it has to be something I actually use. So that Claude is getting new information that's actually useful. that does something valuable. Some of the next videos I'm going to make are around AI readiness, preparing yourself and setting up your knowledge base and setting up your structure so that you can interact with AI in the most meaningful way for your projects, your life, your planning, your business, your team. So I'll be going much more in depth about this. If you enjoy this video, let me know. If you've got any questions, drop me a comment. See you soon.